to transition back to a little bit to our parsha and a little bit to Purim, because I want to talk about one other aspect that is very present in both this morning's parsha and in the story and the Megillah of Esther, and that is clothing. And actually, Joel kind of hinted at it or he didn't hint at it, but he brought it up a little bit when we talk about the Urim v'Tumim, those kind of magical stones, but how distinct apart the priestly uniform is to the Mishkan service, and to kind of elevating and marking the priests, the really ornate vestments that get described this morning of the priests. They serve as really important social and class markers. It's kind of their uniform for how the rest of the nation knows that they are elevated servants of God, and that their place of work is within the Mishkan. And so, going back to what we were talking about before we started the Torah reading, of thinking of, what are all the different tools in the toolbox, right, to form connection, and thinking about the possibility of kind of these special clothes as markers, and as possibly being one of those tools. And it actually, again, in kind of a closer and different reading of the Megillah this year, one of the things that popped out to me in the story of Esther and Mordechai is really just how important clothing is, as a driver of the Purim narrative. And so, first of all, one of probably most famously, even though it's not actually in the Megillah, is the way the whole story starts is Vashti being told to come in front of the king and refusing. And this is something that I think lots of people think is actually explicitly in the text, right? That she was told to come naked before the king. That's not in the text. That's a very famous midrash. But again, we have this idea of being asked to come without clothes, and the vulnerability that would entail, against her wishes, is what leads to her refusal. And so this is where we see the first instance of clothing being a driver of the narrative, is that it is what cuts Vashti out of the story and gives the opening for Esther to rise to her position as queen of Persia. And then the next time that clothing kind of plays a central role is with Mordechai, and him showing up outside the palace gates. This is after the decree of Haman. And so he shows up outside the palace gates dressed in sackcloth and ashes, the traditional clothes of mourning. And Esther's first reaction to this isn't that something is wrong on a national level. She doesn't quite seem to know about the impending tragedy at this point. She just sees her beloved uncle dressed in signs of mourning and doesn't really understand it. And so her first reaction is to send him a fresh set of clothes, which he refuses. And it's only when he refuses these new set of clothes, this kind of the clothes that would return him to a status that she can get her head around a little bit more easily. It's only when he refuses those clothes that she actually sends a messenger out directly to speak to him and to engage him in dialogue. And one of the things I noticed for the first time this year is that Mordechai and Esther don't actually directly speak to each other, right? They only speak through messengers back and forth. I think I had always kind of pictured this being a conversation, right, where Mordechai is really directly and clearly telling Esther the scale of the threat that is facing the Jews in Ahasuerus's kingdom, but that doesn't exist. That only happens in messengers going back and forth, and the only reason that conversation is happening at all is because Mordechai showed up outside the gates in clothes that weren't befitting him, in clothes that didn't fit, what the status of the palace was, or what the status of him as a man of Mordechai's stature was. And Mordechai's fortunes also turn very squarely on clothes. In chapter 6, which Ben Schurz read oh so well on Thursday night, and in giving us a kind of humorous twist on the story, when Haman is asked by Achashverosh, what great honor can we give to someone who the king owes honor? The first thing that pops into his mind is explicitly levush malchut, right? It's very explicitly to dress that person up in royal garments, and of course, what Haman doesn't know at that point is that it's Mordechai who's going to be dressed up in these royal garments. And it's these special clothes that really kind of are the manifestation of the shifting tides and the power dynamics between Haman and Mordechai. And all of this focus on clothing and status really comes to a head in chapter 8. And this is one of the most famous passages in the entire Megillah. Haman has already been deposed. Everything has been revealed. Mordechai has been elevated to Haman's old position. And how is this transformation cemented? The text reads, "Umordechai yatsa milifnei hamelech bilvush malchut tchelet vachur Ba'ateret zahav gedola v'tachrich butz v'argaman v'a'ir Shushan tzahala v'samecha." And Mordechai went forth from the presence of the king in royal clothing of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan shouted and was glad. This seems to be a case of the clothing having made the man. And several of these materials and colors, if you were paying close attention to the words of this morning's Parsha, the gold and the blue and the purple that Mordechai is decked out in, these are also the same materials that are used in the vestments of the high priest. And this verse in Megillat Esther, under some circumstances, it might go unnoticed, of Mordechai being dressed in these really beautiful and decadent clothes, except this is one of the 4 verses in the Megillah which we all say together, which the congregation says aloud before the reader reads them. And so it makes it impossible to overlook how Mordechai is decked out, and it makes it hard to overlook this connection to the priestly garments. It really kind of hammers it home. And this is not a drash that I'm giving. I know that right now we are living in a time of sweatpants. I'm not going to go around and ask everyone, what they're wearing from the waist down on their Zoom screen. And this is not going to be the drash, where I tell you how nice it is to get dressed up for Shabbat or for services. We can save that for another time. But I do think there is something to be gleaned out of this emphasis on special and decadent dress. And I want to bring that back to actually what we talked about before the Torah reading, and really to the first verse of Parshat Tetaveh. And to do that, I want to turn briefly to the concept of light. What's perhaps most famous about the most famous commandment, I think, in Parshat Tetaveh is where we start with God instructing the people to bring pure olive oil to light the Ner Tamid in the Mishkan, to light an eternal light, a tradition that has lasted from the time of the Mishkan up to now. And were you not viewing kind of the back wall of my office behind me, I would point up at the ark and point at the eternal light, that is still going strong over both of our Aron Kodesh, where we house our Torah. And this tradition and practice of having a light always going is something that I think is deeply resonant for many of us. And I think it's something we really expect to find when we walk into holy space. And Mordechai Kaplan writes about this light, that God is the creative flame that transfigures lifeless substance, leaping into higher realms of being, brightening into the radiant glow of feeling, till it runs into the white fire of thought. The Mishkan and the tabernacle and the priestly role in the tabernacle, all of this exists firmly on the boundary between what is ineffable and what is physical. And I think it's a big challenge for us as humans, among the big challenges of religion that we were talking about earlier, is how can we figure out how to convey even just some of that divine power of creativity and transfiguration and radiance? And I do think that the short answer is maybe not that we can't or that the priest couldn't, but that it's really difficult. And that I do think we need to kind of take every opportunity we can to try to explore different methods to do that. And so the priests might not have been able to do it on their own, just with their presence, but they had robes with a hem of pomegranates, of blue, purple, and crimson, and bells of gold between them all around, a golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate. The beauty of these special clothes, the sounds of the bells, were just some of the tools to make a human presence of approaching the divine possible, and to feel in just one more of the many different ways of trying to make God manifest in our own presence. And again, thinking ahead to next week and the sin of the golden calf, and to Megillat Esther and not reading God's name in it, we really need every strategy we can possibly have to build those connections and to find that resilience, and to be able to connect to the divine around us, and to maintain faith even under less than ideal circumstances, whether through a ner tamid, a light that is always lit, that is there to constantly reassure us and bring that little bit of light into our lives, or fancy robes or bells or whatever else we can build into our lives and give ourselves that hope of finding that moment of connection and elevation